Hello, and welcome back to another episode of Advanced Squad Leader. We're still in the streets of Stalingrad, and it's the third turn for the Germans. I don't think I've found the button for broken squads yet, so once again I'm just, going over every hex. Thankfully, I recorded all of these relatively close to each other, so there's at least a few things I could remember with regards to which units are broken versus which weren't. Oh, and lucky me, I get a heat of battle. So once again, Germans don't get any real bonuses. The squad's a first line, so they're not elite. So there's no negatives, and they were broken, so there's only a +1 added to it. Unfortunately for me, that causes them to go berserk, which thankfully we've already seen. But again, I think I'm still stuck in the line of sight stuff, so am I gonna realize that he's allowed to berserk? The moment we're all waiting for. Yeah, this is me just checking some rules. It's probably a good time for me to actually go into the rules myself and pull up the specific passage about the debris and why it's kind of really important to read rules and remember them if you can. Again, ASL has a lot of rules. It's a very complicated game, but you should never let that really get in the way of things. Just play through things, and if you forget stuff, then at least you'll know for next time. Hopefully, anyways. All right. So this rule is more specific for the Red Factory / Red Barricades / Red October, depending on whichever module you actually purchased and own. I believe it also applies to. I believe it also applies to Valor of the Guards, which is yet another campaign game, also based in Stalingrad, although earlier on in the actual taking of the city. More specifically, the time in September versus the current timeline, which is in October, specifically mid-October. So, with debris, the specific passage is the first one. So the first line for debris states that it is inherent terrain. Basically, how do I explain inherent terrain? I believe it's the entire hex, if I remember correctly. I could be wrong on that. I'll probably get back to that at some other time. It's concealment terrain, so at the end of my turn, which I will start doing for the second day, I think, gaining concealment will play a much bigger part once I start applying it again. It also has a +1 terrain effect modifier, which I've been using for all shots against them, and also is a half-level line of sight hindrance. Both of which are cumulative with some other stuff. The important part is the half-level line-of-sight hindrance. And I think the reason why I had an issue with it... So, when something is at a half-level, basically what it does is that blocks view... it blocks line-of-sight everywhere else, and the Russians are really unlucky here, losing another machine gun. Or another support weapon, I should say, to some unlucky rolls. The other one was destruction for Malin. Anyways, so the half-level hex it blocks line of sight on the same level. So that's why somebody at, say, hex, what is that, K3, they wouldn't be able to see into hex M4, even though they're only 2 hexes away. The fact that there's a half-level hex line of sight obstruction in between the two kills that line of sight. Now, the more important part, I guess, because I thought this would be in here, if I look into the index, and this is why I prefer the online manual rather than my book one, but regardless, half-level hex is any terrain feature defined as half-level obstacle blocks all same level line of sight through, not into or out of, that terrain hex. So basically what it means is you can obviously see into the terrain to shoot people there, but you can't see through that hex, so you can't see from M4 into K3 because of L3. Half-level obstacles never form blind hexes, nor block LOS, line of sight, to or from a higher level location. So that was the part that I'd forgotten to go back and read and completely understand until I think this video. This, or maybe the last video, is when I actually started going like, oh right, they don't form blind hexes. The idea behind a blind hex is that you can't see directly behind a house. But if you're at a higher level, you might still not be able to see directly behind the house, but you could see 2 or 3 hexes behind it. So that's how blind hexes work. I'm actually using the proper off-board artillery stuff this time too. However, I believe this is the time this is where I switch it over, because you're allowed to do that. There's nothing that states you can't move your artillery request somewhere else. It's just like spotting rounds. You can correct it if you want, and so on and so forth. Because my guy is at a level 3 hex, which would be 2 levels above that house, I don't believe that house creates a blind hex against him. Thankfully for me, I was allowed to have 2 pre-registered hexes, so I can go straight to fire for effect and start doing damage that way. That was the accuracy die. So the accuracy on a pre-registered hex for the Germans, again, is 4. So 3, I'm easily within that limit. And I don't have to worry about if that artillery is going to travel somewhere else. Now, under normal circumstances, if you're playing against another player, you would pick and choose which hexes get rolled in sequence. Just for usability and peace of mind, I just go in a clockwise fashion. So I'll generally go whatever hex, at least in this viewing format, where the FFE counter is, I always go one above it, clockwise until I get to it again, and then the center one. And that way it's a lot easier. It should be noted that because off-board artillery is an area target type attack, it's not about like having its firepower or anything. The more important thing is that when you are attacking locations such as buildings, it is possible to cause rubble to be generated. It doesn't, I believe, for this strength of firepower. I believe you need 120 millimeters minimum, so 24 firepower, before you can start rubbling stuff. But the more important thing is just that when this is why you want to roll on every last one of your hexes. It is still possible to generate rubble and that sort of thing on the lower sized guns, as far as I'm aware, but only under certain circumstances, namely critical hits. So if you get a critical hit, it like doubles the firepower, does a lot more damage, and that's when that sort of thing will apply. And it's important to roll for that sort of stuff. Again, this is why ASL has a lot of rules that it has. Without them, you just wouldn't have the sort of variability that every playthrough can generate. For instance, if I had rubbled the P6 hex, or even the O7 hex, where I'm currently looking at, if I had rubbled those, anything inside that building dies. There's you don't get a save roll, you don't get anything. It's also possible to rubble, say, the first floor, and then that collapses the second floor, obviously, because of how that works. So it's just way cooler, in my opinion, just with the ability to for that to change, because that can change the gameplay in crazy ways. The fact that that's a factory just makes it really it'll be really tough to get in there and attack it once I actually get there. But if you can rubble it, one, you're eliminating a certain number of stone locations that would be available, and at the same time you're eliminating units that might be in there, or any sort of hidden defenses. You might be making it easier for you to attack it. You can generate debris or rubble in adjacent hexes. It's just the amount of stuff that the ASL has available to it in sort of actions that are responses to things is just, frankly, for me, I love it. So we saw a Boxcar's task check followed up by a almost Boxcar's IFT roll. The task check declares allied booby traps because that's a special scenario rule, or SSR. The Russians always have booby trap capability, and the idea behind it is that booby traps, if you happen to roll a 12 on a task check, I believe you take a morale check. Let me see what the rule says. You can also upgrade that booby trap level. So the worst booby trap level is C. You can also go to a B or an A. Each of those factors drops the roll you need by 1. So you would need a 11 or greater. If you have a level C, it's 12. If you have a level B, it's 11. But if you have a level A booby traps, it's 11 or 12. So you get a catch-all thing, which is really good, because on a booby trap, it causes a casualty reduction to at least 1. So it is possible to, with random selection, get more than one unit subject to that. Which, again, in my opinion, is really good, because if you can get units to do task checks, which a little harder to come by, but if you notice you're pinning a lot of units, that's a task check. It's something for them to roll. So it just gives them an added thing, the German player, an added thing to worry about. Special note: the Germans can't get booby traps of their own, so it's definitely something that the Russian player should try to focus on if possible. You get booby traps, you get you get your snipers. You can easily cover, any low rolls that your opponent usually gets, and any bad rolls that he gets can be extra punishing. I'm prep firing with a few units here because, frankly, The fact that I have a bunch of units under DM or Desperation Morale in the stone structures that I'm trying to move through really doesn't make me want to move out with anybody else. I'd prefer keeping them there just to sort of protect the units in case anything happens. And at the same time, I want other units that are in good order to be able to rush in and capture some locations. So another thing to keep in mind, there's a lot of modifiers to a 2-hit roll. So first off, my tank is shooting at a fortified structure, and he's buttoned up. He's not moving, but all in all, that's still a... so it's a 3 plus 4 plus 1 for bundled up. And I believe that's it. So that'd be an 8, and that's why you passed. Rolling another 3 was just lucky on my part. And because of the shot, it because I used the TEM on the 2-hit roll, I couldn't use it in the modification for the IFT roll, which is why that 3 was really good and caused a casualty reduction. And unfortunately, the SMG company guy was just... He's already broken, and 4 is really hard to get in the first place, so that conscript level squad was destined to be defeated. I guess I should point out that I'm also going to be doing... I'm also making a bit of an error here in calculation for casualty victory points. That becomes very important for campaign games, and frankly, I should have been doing it a lot more. Just because when you're doing a refit phase, which we'll see in quite a few videos, you definitely want to keep track of that because it will affect some rolls further down the line. If I don't choose to restart it, because I don't think the refit phase is really going to be fun or interesting to watch for people, because I'll have to do some setups afterwards and all that. I'll probably just leave what I did as is to be fair for both sides, because that's how I calculated it for both sides, and then we'll go from there. I might double check afterwards and just give everybody some extra points, just so that they can buy more stuff, because heck, it's always going to be fun to see a lot more units on the map, especially with how big this map is. Just looking at the scroll bar, we're not anywhere near the bottom. So, actually, speaking of, I believe this map is something along the lines of. We can see that it's JJ, so 26J is 10, so there's 36 hexes wide, and it's about 45 hexes, 46 hexes, 45 or 46 hexes in height. So double that height, because Red Factories or Red October attaches to the southern portion of this map. So when you have a 36 by 90 hex grid, or hex field, I guess, it gets pretty crazy. And since I'll be running technically 2 campaigns together, definitely going to see hundreds of counters all over the place. Frankly, it's going to be by itself just a challenge. Figuring out, okay, who's going to shoot, and what do I want to do, and how am I going to move stuff, despite the large amount of space that I'll most likely be afforded. I generally have a huge problem with determining how much I should shoot. I'm sure I've mentioned this before, but I feel like it always comes up. The idea of picking and choosing who should become subject to attacks is kind of crazy to me. I think, again, going back to the fact that I'm playing both sides, it just makes it a little bit harder for me to choose who I'm going to attack. I don't feel like I have to worry too much against a human opponent. Not implying I'm robotic or anything, but it's harder, or easier, I should say, to just pick and choose what I want to do when it's simply a matter of, what can I guesstimate he's going to do and how much firepower do I think he can bring to it, and leave it at that, really. So here I'm trying to use the leader, the 9-1 leader, as a spotter for the mortar. As a spotter, I believe he forfeits his modifier, the leader modifier, and on top of that, there's also a +2 to hit. The idea is that the mortars have to communicate with the leader, who has to give them directions, and sometimes there's a bit of a disconnect there, and you gotta talk it out a lot more. So yeah, we can see that the 2 hit takes a +2, and I don't believe, I don't believe that the leader can apply their modifier to that roll. So you gotta start rolling low when it comes to area fire with mortars. Now, I don't know if I put one. I should be putting down an acquisition. Or do they not get one? Now I'm curious again. Alright, spotted fire. A leader stacked with a spotter may not modify a mortar's 2-hit dice roll, but one stacked with another unit firing a support weapon mortar may modify one mortar's 2-hit dice roll. A unit may spot for more than one mortar in a player turn only if the mortars are all in the same location and firing at the same target. The squad may attack with its inherent firepower and spot for one or more mortars, but will lose any acquisition gained with the mortars when it does so attack. So I think what it's saying there is that I could gain acquisition, unless that leader does something else. So if they're working in tandem, they could definitely get some spotting going. Oh, and this might seem weird, but again, with Berserk, you have to charge. First off, Berserk is the first move you need to make. So if you're ever playing an ASL, you get a unit that berserks for whatever reason, and by the time your move phase comes around and he's still berserk, it must be the first move. This is actually a really good rule to remember because, well, frankly, you really want to have your berserk guys move first anyways. I was actually really unlucky for that particular berserk guy because berserk units can't pin, and if a unit can't pin and you have like a morale check you're trying to do, it means they'll casualty reduce. So I was hoping I could bring in a full squad into this area and do something about it, but unfortunately that won't be the case. And now like a 237, I think it is. Well, technically 2310 because berserk status. Just going to make it a little bit tougher to actually finish off a unit. Because again, a berserk unit, the only way for a berserk unit to drop its berserk status is by getting into close combat with against an enemy unit and effectively eliminating them. And obviously the only other way would be to lose sight of any and all enemies. It's also really unfortunate for me to have rolled, not rolled, but it's unfortunate that I had to go through so much debris because it costs a lot more move factors for my guy to actually get where I would have preferred him to go. Oh, and I was just rolling for defensive fire there, but that we're not in that phase. I don't know why I was doing that. Instead, I'm going to try and draw fire and hopefully have this work. Again, this is sort of the thing between playing as both sides. If I prep a lot, or technically if you're just playing one side, whatever. But if you prep a lot, it does give the intent to your opponent how many units he's going to need to keep active, we'll say, in order to shoot. And what I mean by that is that I can only move 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 with the current one, 6, maybe 7 stacks of units that I can do really anything with. And that presents a really big problem because that just means that if the Russians can get 7 attacks on those units, barring anything terrible happening, it's kind of easy to do. You kind of know how much effort you need to put into it and what else you'll need to worry about later. Also, the boxcars was really unfortunate because that effectively kills the ability for that machine gun to do anything. If it had rolled an 11, not with leader, but if it had rolled doubles, sometimes that kills the rate of fire as well. But rolling boxcars was really bad because that's one of their better machine guns they have access to. At this point, I'm just trying to see if my moves can be intercepted by anything. The half-level hex, the debris everywhere that's causing half-level hex line-of-sight hindrances is actually really beneficial for your attacker because you can run around on a lot of the ground level in quite a few areas and not have to worry about getting shot at. And if your opponent isn't... if they don't quite understand the limitations of those sight lines, it can be very problematic for them. And say, here's another issue that I didn't really calculate all too well. And technically, I probably should have shot with those guys earlier, but hey, now they're shooting at somebody with a submachine gun. Or, not a submachine gun, but a light machine gun. So that's down 2 because of non-assault movement and open ground. Like a dummy, I'm not using... I wasn't using single stack movement or a single unit movement. I really should move those units separately. But thankfully, he only got a Pintash check, and it was good enough for both of them to pass. For those curious, if you equal your morale on a Pintash check, you pass it. It's only on a morale check that if you pass it with the highest possible number that you get pinned as a result. You might also be wondering why is it that I was even, because like 4 firepower on a, what is that, 5, it, you might think it would have been a morale check or something, but the units in that hex can actually take benefit from the wall that extends out to the road. You can see how it goes towards H4, crosses over, and back down into, I believe, I6. Yeah, I6. And once more, I'm trying to bust through with some German Sturm Company guys, but unfortunately the dice just, they're definitely with the Russians in these instances. It also hasn't helped that a lot of the prep fire that I was doing in the attempts to try and gain some ground, or at least soften up the Russians, really hasn't been going too well. On the plus side, though, the fact that I'm now breaking further and further south is really going to make it hard for the Russians at the moment, because they really don't have enough manpower to spread out a lot. The only reason why the Russians have like a lot of guys right now, or at least one of the main reasons anyways, is just the fact that I bought quite a few militia companies, or I bought 2, and I think I bought an extra SMG company if I remember correctly. Actually, I'll just pull up the numbers. Or at least I gotta hope to remember which ones I did buy. So definitely remember buying 2 militia companies, and I think it was a submachine gun company as well that I bought. The submachine gun company and the 2 militia companies really it provided a lot of manpower, but unfortunately the manpower just it's not really high quality, as you might expect just from militias to begin with, and so you're kind of stuck in the first scenario. How much do you want to spread it out versus how much the Germans have in terms of being able to attack, and so on and so forth. It's an interesting, very interesting scenario though, I find, because you're given tanks, but they don't really have free roam, if that makes any sense. Because there's just there's so much debris and so many streets all over the place that it really gets hard to move anywhere and do anything. I kind of, like, looking back on it, I feel like I may have made some of the stone locations in the top left corner of everything just a little bit too weakly defended. I was kind of hinging more on the middle portion of the defense to be the anchor point, and even though like I was able to take out 1 tank, I think that second AT gun would have just been much better in terms of effectiveness if I'd been able to cover it a little bit more. I'm not sure if I actually mentioned it, but a unit that attacks, if it has a support weapon, it doesn't have to use the support weapon in its attack, which is actually really important to understand, because first off, if a unit uses a support weapon, it can use a support weapon as well as its inherent firepower, or it could also use a support weapon and then a second support weapon. You're allowed to use 2. It's just that using 2 negates your firepower. So sometimes a good idea to do is to deploy your forces at the start of a scenario, like in pre-setup, which I never do, because I always forget about it. And then if you can find a half squad that has a good firepower and morale, even if the range isn't so good, and technically even if the firepower is not too great, I find if they have a good morale at least, then you can stack them with 2 machine guns, and just, you can have that as a really good defensive position, because the rate of fire that you'd get with both of them and so on, it's just really strong. Also here I got really lucky, not only for the cower, which caused the firepower to go down, but the good dice roll from the advancing squad. The residual firepower also is a really good indication as to how much firepower can be left behind. I believe I think that should have been a 4 firepower instead of 6, but regardless, if another unit, I don't want to say strays into that location, but if another unit moves in there, it's immediately very dangerous for them to do so. When you come under that immediate attack from the fire table, that can be very significant. Now, I know what I want to do, which is, with that leader, I'm trying to use the demolition charge against the fortified position to cause a breach, which would make it possible for my units to advance in there. Under normal circumstances, a fortified building, if it's occupied by an enemy unit, you can't advance into it. I believe there's a couple exceptions with the Stalingrad stuff, but not that would be applicable in this specific instance. If I was in the trench, I believe I could advance into it because it considers the trench connected to like an opening in the building. But a fortified building in and of itself, you wouldn't be able to advance into. So what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to get my leader to run in, and he's an 8 down 0, which isn't great or anything, but it's the best of what I've got at the moment. And I feel like if I use a leader to do this, it might be better, because if he breaks, then when he runs back, or when he routes away, which would be super easy in this instance, but if he routes away, then I at least will be able to rally him, or at least hopefully rally him rather quickly. Anyways, so to use demolition charge, it's a little annoying, I find. Basically what you have to do is you have to get adjacent to your target, like where you want to place or throw your demolition charge. And then you have to expend if you're trying to place a demolition charge, you have to expend a certain amount of movement factors to effectively get into that hex as if you were to move into it, and then move back into your original hex. So in this case, it would cost me, I believe, 3 movement factors. It would cost me 2 to get in to the location with the building, and then another 1 to go back to its original position, which is the street. And those movement factors count as movement spent in the hex that it currently occupies, and not the hex that it would be in should it successfully place a demolition charge. I believe that's how it goes. The reason why that's actually really annoying is because if you're trying to place a demolition charge and you're in the streets, well, you're basically giving a unit a lot of opportunities to shoot you constantly. A unit can shoot at you for as many times as you're spending movement factors, and when they're right next to you, that means their firepower is doubled. So right now, that 227 isn't very strong, but you have to double it. Well, first off, you have to have it for being pinned, but you double it. Technically, I think you double it first, but whatever. So it's 2 firepower. However, that 2 firepower is occurring on a leader that is non-assault moving and in open ground. So it's a down 2. So now that shot, instead of being 7, is actually a 5. And that's super important. And it's why it's really tough to use demolition charges, in my opinion. And why if I had smoke, that would have been really smart of me to do, to plan it ahead of time. But wasn't the case. And then maybe the open or non-assault movement didn't count or something. But anyways, because I pin task checked, it means it kills the movement. I can't move anymore. And movement in the process of placing a demolition charge negates that action. So my great plan of placing a demolition charge on this building, have it explode, hopefully do something to the occupants, and then continue on with that sort of thing. Unfortunately, not the case. And I didn't want to move the leader down 1 because of the residual firepower, which would have made it really tough for them to actually do anything. Also, I don't believe that shot would have been legal, because I think as a subsequent first fire, you have to attack a unit that's adjacent to you, rather than at that distance. Anyways, going back to it, the residual fire, I feel, is what modified my plan as to where I wanted to go, which is unfortunate, because I really would have preferred being able to have that leader go in there and then toss a demolition charge somewhere. And of course, double boxcars for the Russians, so I gotta make it up and give them a Snake Eyes, which is effectively a kill. It's an open first fire non-assault movement, so it's down 1, open ground down 2, it's a 0. Yeah, that guy's dead. And that's a really good unit, so yeah, good job on the Russians there. Really, I should be thanking Dice, if anything, but you know, I have my own issues with dice rolls. In kind of a story that will haunt me probably forever, is I was playing a 3-player game at one point versus 2 local players, really nice guys, and we happened to pick. And 3-player scenarios are actually really rare in ASL, but we had the time and availability, so we made it work. And I believe it was a scenario with the Germans, British, and partisans, if I remember correctly. I think it was somewhere in Greece. And all I can say is, or at least my only advice to people is, most people use glasses, like see-through glasses, not like glasses you wear but drink from, to toss their dice in or shake the cup with the dice in so that they can get dice rolls, because you don't want to toss dice on a physical version of this map. It takes enough time to set everything up and remember where everything is. You don't want to knock over a stack. However, in my unfortunate luck, I didn't have a cup with me, so I brought a Tupperware container. Because hey, you can see through a Tupperware container, whatever. And I would just toss dice in there, shake the cup or shake the container, and then reveal the dice. Unfortunately, that day I must have rolled about 20 rolls at a 10 or above, and frankly, those were all on fire attacks and rally rolls. So you can imagine how many times I failed morale checks and missed shots and effectively didn't accomplish anything. If I had to calculate like how much damage I'd done, I'd probably done less than 4 casualty victory points, and it was a fairly decently sized game. It wasn't small, it wasn't big by any stretch, but suffice to say, really bad. So. And this is also another example of just how devastating low shots can be. So I'd gotten a really good roll with the Russians. Technically, the crew can't be stunned here, so I put a pin on them. I'm not sure if that's the right move, but anyways. So the big problem with movement, and why you should always be wary of just how much of an opportunity you're giving the enemy to shoot at you, they got a really good roll, and it casualty reduced my guy, but it also forced everybody in the hex to also take a morale check. So my guy went from a full squad to a half squad, and even though they passed their roll, their morale check, it activated a sniper in doing so, which caused issues, quote unquote, elsewhere on the map. This is the kind of follow-up or additional randomness that really comes into play, especially with the bigger scenarios, and why, as the Russians, it's going to be very beneficial the more and more investment you put into getting units, or into getting your sniper support higher and your booby trap higher, because you're basically causing an attrition to the Germans the more and more you do this sort of thing. And frankly, that's pretty close to historically what the Russians were trying to achieve anyways. So. Actually, now that I think about it, I'm not sure if that hex has... Oh, it does have a wall. I don't think I ever added that +2 to the wall. Or for the wall, I should say. So maybe there might have been an extra little support there for the Germans. And I might not have suffered as greatly there. But, well, I mean, I'm 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, probably like seven or 8 more videos, I think, maybe more. So it's not like I'll ever be able to go back here. I think another good example about why residual fire is actually really dangerous, and why you really need to pay attention as to how you perform movement in this game. If it wasn't for that residual fire, I wouldn't have moved a unit around that hex. So it would have been a lot easier for me to get a unit right next to that giant stone location with a really good Russian leader, and progress that way. That way, excuse me. I think at this point I was also having a really big issue with trying to recenter where exactly I wanted to go. I guess the best way to put it would be because I prep fired with so many guys, and moving on the right side of the map is basically impossible for me now. I can't shift the tank over there to provide cover, just because the road is covered by everybody. I can't really do much else with those units, short of just bringing them back to the western side. But that also has a lot of open ground before I get to any actual buildings. And I need stone locations for my victory conditions. So it gets really tough to be able to do anything. Technically, I should have probably not shot with those guys, because I technically shot earlier, but whatever. We'll give the Russians another mulligan here. So that would have been 16 firepower, I think. Coward, so would have been 1 to the left, so 12. and then plus 4. So that was an 8 on 12. Which evidently broke the crew, unless I'm counting it wrong. But I also didn't put any final fire counters on those guys, which I think I eventually go back to and wonder if I'd shot with them. Oh, and for anybody who's... Man, I forgot about boxcars there. That would have actually been really bad. For anybody who's still getting into this, this is another reason why you kind of want to save a couple shots for after the fact. In my opinion, anyways. You can get some good bonuses with the minus, any sort of minus modifier you can apply to moving units, and that's really good. You should take advantage of it, obviously. But if there's a couple of units that you want to save just for some follow-up shots, it's always a good idea as well. At least in my opinion, and I'm not a pro or anything by any means, so take this as just my own opinion. But I find it beneficial because if you happen to break units that move outside of a stack, you can only shoot whatever is moving, not the entire stack, obviously. If they start piling up into the same end hex. Now, the reason why that's important to save shots, again in my mind, after the fact, is that if you have multiple guys that have just been broken because they're trying to move in to assault you, a unit that's hidden to the side or inside a trench that shoots after the move phase while both units are broken, basically just you have an increased chance of reducing them after the move phase. Now, maybe the smarter play is to make a fire group with everybody and shoot at them anyways, but at least it gives you the option, if anything goes wrong, to follow it up. So if you cower or break your gun or whatever on the first roll, at least you can get a follow-up shot with a second guy after the fact. I'm pretty sure I've already mentioned it, but residual fire does not follow through for the rest of the turn. After your move phase, residual fire gets removed from the map. I just haven't done it yet. One of the great subconscious things that nobody ever really, well, I shouldn't say nobody, but you don't really think about when looking at the game, unless you play it, of course. But when looking at the game, you've got your prep fire it's colorful, it's got its orange, and oh look, the defensive fire is all purple, and that's cute, and the desperation morales are blue, and pins are red, and at a certain point you start to wonder, why is it that all these things are colored differently? And it's not necessarily to make it easier to differentiate between the two, although that is a bonus, but you'll notice that on the right, every phase has a different color. So subconsciously it's telling you which phase that counter is removed on, at the end of anyways. So residuals are green, the movement phase is green. At the end of the movement phase you take off the residuals. The only exception is prep fire because prep fire and advanced fire use the same color. So that's the only thing you want to keep in mind. But basically, because those two are orange, it's very easy to remember, like, oh, advanced fire, that's when I would take off both prep and advanced stuff. And because Vassal is very easy to use, it's very nice and very simple to do cleanup. Oh, keep in mind, this is a really bad position. I could have had those guys route further, but I didn't. And the fact that I did not was a poor decision on my part. The first reason why that's a poor choice is that that's not a building location. So I don't get a -1 to my rally rolls. So even if I could self-rally that guy in the following turn, hint, I can't because it's a Russian turn, but even if I could rally them, I don't get a modifier I only get a positive modifier, which is not good for rally attempts. In addition to that, I didn't route the extra 2 movement factors into C8. Now, I think that would have been overstacking, which has its own penalties, which I gleefully glossed over a couple of videos ago, I believe. But had I moved that unit into a location with a leader, I can then attempt to rally him at least. If you don't go that route because of chances to rally and so on, that's fine. But I really should not have ended him in a debris location. I should have tossed him into a building anywhere. And I've got at least 3 other selections if I didn't want to choose one that was semi-exposed. Routing is actually a little confusing when you start playing. I gotta admit, it took me a while before I actually understood the rule, just because I'd been reading it wrong for a long time. Specifically, there's one thing to always keep in mind when routing, and that's that you have to choose. You basically have to declare a destination before you start moving your broken guy. I don't know too many people that do declare before moving. It's just kind of like, oh, I'll go, to here. It costs me 2 movement factors to get there, and so on. But maybe it's just who I play against. It's kind of more casual settings or whatever. But you have to declare where your guy is going. Excuse me. And you have to pick the closest woods or building location. Now there are some exceptions to that. You can go to a different location if possible. You can go further away if you can. You can't if there's a building with some Germans into it, but there's another available location. You wouldn't route towards the enemy. That just wouldn't make sense. So you basically pick a safe location for them to go to. You can also route further than you need to if you have the movement factors for it. So basically, I never really understood that you need to move towards a building or a woods. At the start, when I started to play, I was just doing some basic starter kit stuff. And it was more of just, okay, I have to route away from the enemy unit rather than go towards specific locations. On top of that, there's certain restrictions. You can't move towards a known enemy unit. You can't move closer in any way, shape, or form. Now, if they don't know that a unit is at a specific location, that's fine. You can still route closer to those guys, and that's how you have rare cases of routing forwards. But otherwise, there's you just can't do certain routes. But again, you can route, say, how do I put this? If you had a unit in B6, you could route towards B7 because you can't see enemy units that are further south, so that's fine. You could also route towards B7 even though there's a unit in B8 because you didn't know that at the time. They could not see that enemy unit. However, if you route from B6 to B7 and spot the guys in B8, because once you're in that building you then have line of sight, you would then have to route away from that unit. If you can't route because you don't have any more movement factors, which is 6, if you don't have any more movement factors, you are dead. If you can't route away in a way that's safe, again, that unit's dead. So it's something to keep in mind. In fact, that's one of the reasons why that militia company unit had to be killed, because it can't route out of the trench, because the trench is considered a separate location from the ground level. So if I wanted to route him, say southeast, I'd have to get him out of the trench first, which still counts as being adjacent. And then I'd have him route away, which he'd be interdicted, I believe. There's at least the Panzer would be able to interdict, I believe. And then that incurs its own problems and a morale check and so on. He can't route towards the fortified building, even though it's technically a connection, which would be legal to do, because it's still adjacent to an enemy unit, despite the fact that that's a fortified location. And this is the button I was talking about earlier. So when you hit that button, it displays everything as broken, or broken either as a malfunctioned gun or broken as a squad, which is actually really helpful to know. The advanced phase is the last sort of movement that you can do in the turn. I'm pretty sure I've already explained that once or twice. It's one of the reasons why it's completely fine to, if you so choose, make moves that don't get you specifically to an area you want to get into. You just save that for the advanced phase. The bonus to doing that is that you could say, a good example being the rifle company guy in E6 right now. If I move up into the debris field and don't complete my move into the building, then I don't have to worry about anybody shooting into that building, because they'd still have a non-assault movement, so there'd still be a -1 to the roll, and I could just complete that movement in the advanced phase, and therefore not have to worry about it, because you can't be shot in the advanced phase. The downside is obviously that you can't use advancing fire, because by virtue of not being able to be shot, you can't shoot. So it's kind of a iffy proposition to do. This is also probably a really bad idea, and I probably shouldn't have done it. So instead of retreating that squad southeast, which is, again, probably a better idea, because I could have routed him excuse me, I could have routed him southeast and then straight south because of the debris, and I don't believe anybody had line of sight anywhere. Instead, I routed him up into the second floor, and the problem with that is that I believe there was a squad that wasn't under desperation morale, and now both squads are. And unless I can get some miracle rallies, I'm kind of out of luck at the moment. I just won't be able to truly save them if anything happens. Another thing that's going to suck is that because those squads are going to be perpetually under desperation morale now, if I don't eliminate that squad, that German squad on the first floor by the route phase, both of those squads will be eliminated for failure to route, because they cannot remain adjacent, they can't route through the unit, and there's nowhere else for them to go. And as you might imagine, there's probably going to be a lot of combat, melee combat or close combat, I should say, this turn. Or at least, it's always nice to have a return of close combat. I'm probably being a little too passive with some of my stuff here. Like my 9 down 2 leader, I could probably advance him south, exchange the medium machine gun that I just advanced with the light machine gun going back down south, because the wall does block line of sight, so there's a little bit of safety there. Either way, we're going into some close combat. it's important to read how certain units are affected. The fact that pin is a red counter, so it only gets removed at the end of the close combat phase, is actually really important, because a pin unit does have a modifier to its firepower. It's a little confusing in how you read it, because in the table we see it says X 1/2. So you have a firepower. But the problem is it's put under the CCDRM list. So for the longest time, well, maybe not the longest time, but initially anyways, I thought that it doubled your roll. Like you take your lowest dice roll or your roll completely and you modify it by 2. Because it doesn't make sense that you would have your dice roll, because you want to roll below your odds, not above them. And even if it was multiply, anyways. Point is that I always thought that was really confusing, and I don't know why they didn't mark it specifically as firepower next to those numbers. So again, a pin halves the firepower. So in the current hex that we're looking at, F9 I believe it is, we're looking at a 5 firepower squad for the Germans, being in a close combat versus a 4-3-6 or 4-2-6, sorry, and a 5-2-7. You don't have to worry about morales or range in close combat, which is great. You're just looking at firepowers, really. Firepowers, you can kind of do a lot of crazy stuff with close combat, namely in how you assign attackers and defenders. Now, it wouldn't make sense for me to attack, as the Germans, to attack the entire stack, because the odds in that instance would be a 2.5, because the 527 is halved for being pinned. So you're looking at 2.5 plus 4, so 6.5 versus my 5, which, if you're looking at the odds ratio, even though that's close to 1-to-1, you always use the worst option. So I would actually, on a 5-to-6 or 6.5, whatever you choose, I would actually be moving myself down to a 1-to-2 odds ratio. And that's really bad, obviously. However, because my unit is a 5 firepower unit, and the 527 is half firepower, if I decide to target it and it alone, I'm working on a 2-to-1 ratio, which is actually really good, considering what's available. So instead of a 4 or less, I just need a 7 or less. I believe, because that is stone debris, it doesn't count as a building, and therefore, close combat, it does not get an ambush modifier. Let me see if there's anything specific to that. Yeah, so that's just a rubble location and not an actual building. Let me see, printed rubble. Yeah, so it doesn't state anything with regards to modifying close combat, so there's no ambush dice. There's no ambush roll, so you don't determine anything like that. So we're just working off of firepowers and whatever modifiers that might apply. Now there's no, for the Germans, there's no heroic DRM, there's no ambush, he's not CX, which is another thing you got to keep on, and that's why CX stays on till the end of the turn. CX actually stays until the end of the second, the next move phase that applies to that unit, I believe. That one's the only really weird one. CX is a weird one. Anyways, so there's no capture attempt because I don't want to capture them. Nobody's broken, so that's not modifying anything. And there's a couple other things that won't apply. So again, I just need a 7, whereas the 2 Russians will pair up and will attack the German and on a 1-to-1 because it's not 3-to-2. Now, I'm trying to remember which one I rolled for first specifically. I should have rolled the Germans first, right? Yeah, so because the Russians were on the 1-1 and not a 3-2, that 6 was just one shy of elimination. And the same goes for the Germans. They are missing 2 off of their number, so they didn't eliminate the Russians. Now, the close combat, you only roll one close combat attempt for both sides, or depending on how everything plays out. And then if there's no result, they stay in a melee. So those guys are now stuck there. There will be some options to do stuff in the next close combat phase, but for now, those guys can't do anything. And that's really bad for the Russians that need the manpower, especially for that location or that side now, which is kind of getting overwhelmed at the moment. But that's going to end this turn. So, as always, thanks for watching, and I will see you for the next episode.